Hey guys, tonight we're not just looking at crimes. We're examining the birth of legends. We're delving into the chilling process by which a series of brutal acts transforms an unknown person into a phantom, a boogeyman whose name echoes through history precisely because it isn't real. These are the stories of killers who were never caught, who became something more than human in our collective imagination. A specter haunting the gaslit alleys of Victorian London, a hooded figure stalking a lover's lane in post-war America. They are mysteries defined not by a resolution, but by a chilling, permanent question mark. The cases we'll be exploring are about the power of a name without a face. They show how, in the absence of facts, fear and folklore rush in to fill the void. These are the crimes that created the very template for the modern serial killer mythos, terrifying communities and baffling investigators who were left with nothing but a gruesome pattern and a taunting, empty space where a suspect should be. Before you get comfortable, maybe take a moment to glance at a shadow in the corner of your room, how it seems to form a shape that is almost, but not quite, recognizable. It's in that space of uncertainty, that formless dread, that these stories live. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're ready to walk these haunted historical streets with us and confront the legends that were born there. And as always, please let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's a powerful experience to see our community gathered around this virtual campfire from all over the world. Now dim the lights. Let's step back in time, into the fog, and meet the first and most famous phantom of them all. Jack the Ripper. The autumn of 1888 was a season of fear in London. In the heart of the world's most powerful empire, there was a dark, festering wound known as the East End. And within the East End, the district of Whitechapel was its most desperate, squalid, and dangerous corner. It was a labyrinth of narrow, gaslit alleys, cobbled streets slick with grime, and overcrowded, dilapidated tenement houses. This was a world of profound poverty, where thousands lived hand-to-mouth, trapped in a brutal cycle of gin palaces, workhouses, and disease. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and despair. It was in this dark, forgotten corner of a great metropolis that a new kind of monster was about to be born. A killer whose name would become synonymous with the very idea of the mysterious, methodical serial murderer. He would become known to history as Jack the Ripper. The victims of the Ripper were all women, all residents of this desperate world. They were not just prostitutes, as history has so often and so simply labeled them. They were mothers, wives, and daughters who had fallen on hard times. Women trapped by poverty, alcoholism, and a society that offered them no safety net. They sold themselves on the dark streets of Whitechapel not out of choice, but out of a desperate need to earn enough pennies to pay for a bed in a common lodging house for the night, to avoid the cold, unforgiving street. They were the most vulnerable of the vulnerable, living on the absolute margins of society. And it was this vulnerability that their killer so ruthlessly exploited. While there were other murders in Whitechapel that year, the official reign of the Ripper, the so-called canonical 5 victims, is believed to have begun on the last day of August. The first victim was Mary Ann Polly Nichols. She was 43 years old, a mother of 5 who had become estranged from her husband and had fallen into a life of poverty and alcoholism. On the night of August 31st, 1888, she was seen trying to earn enough money for a bed. She was turned away from her lodging house, telling the keeper she would be back soon, that she would earn the money with the help of her new bonnet. She walked off into the darkness. A few hours later, just before 4 a.m., her body was discovered by a cart driver on Bucks Row, a dark and quiet street. She was lying on her back. Her throat had been cut so deeply that she was nearly decapitated. Her abdomen had been slashed open with a series of brutal, jagged wounds. The attack was savage, but it was also chillingly quick and quiet. No one had heard a scream. The police surgeon who examined the body noted that the wounds, while frenzied, were inflicted with a long, sharp knife, and with a certain degree of anatomical knowledge. It was a horrifying murder, but the police initially treated it as just another tragic, brutal killing in a violent part of the city. They had no idea that it was only the beginning. Just over a week later, on the morning of September 8th, the killer struck again. This time, the victim was 47-year-old Annie Chapman. Like Polly Nichols, Annie's life had been one of tragedy and decline. She had lost a child, her marriage had fallen apart, and she had succumbed to alcoholism, living a transient life in the lodging houses of Spitalfields. In the early morning hours of September 8th, she too was short of the money for her bed and went out onto the streets. Her body was found later that morning, at around 6 a.m., in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, a crowded tenement building. The discovery was horrifying. She had been killed in the same manner as Polly Nichols, her throat slit and her abdomen viciously mutilated. But this time, the killer had gone further. He had excised her uterus and part of her bladder with a terrifying surgical precision, taking them with him as a gruesome trophy. He had also neatly arranged some of her personal belongings, her rings and a few coins, at her feet. It was a strange act of order amidst the absolute chaos of the murder, a detail that baffled investigators. With the murder of Annie Chapman, the city of London awoke to a terrifying new reality. This was not a random act of violence. This was the work of a single, methodical killer, a man who was hunting the women of Whitechapel. A wave of panic gripped the East End. The press, particularly the new breed of sensationalist, penny dreadful newspapers, fanned the flames of fear. They gave the killer a name: the Whitechapel murderer. The story became a national obsession. The investigation was placed in the hands of the Metropolitan Police, specifically the detectives from Scotland Yard. The lead investigator was Inspector Frederick Aberline, a seasoned and respected detective. But Aberline and his team were faced with an unprecedented challenge. They were trying to hunt a new kind of predator in an environment that was almost perfectly designed to conceal him. There was no forensic science as we know it today. They had no fingerprinting, no DNA analysis, no psychological profiling. The investigation had to be conducted through painstaking, old-fashioned police work. The challenges were immense. The streets of Whitechapel were a maze of unlit alleys and courtyards, offering a killer endless opportunities to strike and vanish. The population was transient and deeply distrustful of the police. The victims themselves were women who lived their lives in the shadows, making it nearly impossible to trace their final movements or identify potential witnesses. The killer seemed to be a phantom, a ghost who could emerge from the London fog, commit an act of unspeakable brutality, and then disappear back into the teeming, anonymous crowds of the East End without leaving a single clue behind. The police were inundated with theories and suspects. They questioned hundreds of people: butchers, slaughterhouse workers, and even doctors and medical students, believing the killer's surgical skill pointed to a medical background. But every lead went cold. The public, in their fear, began to see the Ripper everywhere. Rumors and accusations flew, and innocent men were targeted by vigilante mobs. The atmosphere in Whitechapel was one of pure, unadulterated terror. The women of the night were afraid to walk the streets, but they had no choice. To stay off the streets meant a night in the cold, or worse, the workhouse. They were trapped between the fear of the killer and the crushing reality of their poverty. The police were powerless, the public was terrified, and the killer was still out there. He had now murdered 2 women, each crime more brutal than the last. His confidence was growing. The city waited in dread, wondering when and where the Whitechapel murderer would strike next. They would not have to wait long. The night that would forever cement the killer's legend, a night of shocking, unprecedented violence that would earn him his infamous, permanent name, was just around the corner. The autumn of terror had only just begun. In the weeks following the murder of Annie Chapman, the city of London was in the grip of a full-blown panic. The Whitechapel murderer was no longer just a local crime story. He was a national obsession, a phantom haunting the imagination of the entire country. The press, with its lurid and sensationalist reporting, fueled the hysteria. The police, led by the beleaguered Inspector Aberline, were under immense pressure, but they were chasing a ghost. They had no physical evidence, no reliable witnesses, and a list of potential suspects that was both impossibly long and frustratingly empty. And the killer was not finished. The night of September 30th, 1888, would prove to be the most terrifying and audacious display of his reign of terror, a night that would become known as the double event. The killer's third victim was Elizabeth Long Liz Stride. She was a 44-year-old Swedish immigrant whose life had been a long, slow decline into poverty and alcoholism. On the night of September 29th, she was seen in and around the pubs of Whitechapel, trying to earn money for her lodging. Several witnesses saw her late that night in the company of a man described as being of respectable appearance, wearing a dark coat and a deerstalker hat. At around 1 a.m. on the morning of the 30th, a man named Louis Diemschutz, a local steward, was driving his pony and cart into the gateway of Dutfield's yard, a dark, cobblestone space off Burner Street. His pony suddenly shied and refused to go further. Diemschutz, thinking there was an obstacle in the way, got down from his cart to investigate. In the dim light, he saw what he thought was a bundle of rags lying on the ground. He nudged it with his whip, and then, as his eyes adjusted, he realized with horror that it was the body of a woman. It was Elizabeth Stride. Her throat had been cut, and she was lying in a pool of blood. But unlike the previous victims, her body had not been mutilated. The police surgeon who examined her believed that the killer had been interrupted. The arrival of Diemschutz's cart had likely scared him off just moments after he had committed the murder, forcing him to flee before he could complete his gruesome ritual. This theory suggested that the killer was still out there, his bloodlust unslaked, his rage frustrated. The police believed he would almost certainly strike again, and soon, they were right. Less than an hour later, and less than a mile away, the Ripper found his next victim. Catherine Eddowes was 46 years old. Like the other victims, her life was one of poverty and struggle. Earlier that evening, she had been arrested for public drunkenness and had been held in a cell at the Bishopsgate police station until she sobered up. She was released at 1 a.m., the very same time Elizabeth Stride's body was being discovered. As she left the station, she cheerfully told the desk sergeant, "Good night, old cock." She walked off into the darkness, directly into the path of the killer. At 1:45 a.m., a police constable, PC Edward Watkins, was walking his beat through Mitre Square, a small, dark, and secluded public square within the city of London. It was a place he patrolled every 15 minutes. Just a quarter of an hour earlier, the square had been empty, but now, lying in a dark corner, he found the horrifically mutilated body of Catherine Eddowes. The killer, having been interrupted in his attack on Elizabeth Stride, had found a new victim and had completed his work with a savage and terrifying speed. Her throat was slit, and her abdomen had been ripped open. The mutilations were far more extensive than any of the previous victims. The killer had removed her left kidney and a large portion of her uterus, taking them with him. The attack was so brutal and so surgically precise that it seemed to confirm the theory that the killer had anatomical knowledge. The fact that he had been able to commit such a complex and time-consuming act in a public square, in the 15-minute window between a policeman's patrols, was a display of almost unbelievable audacity and speed. The double event plunged London into a new level of terror. The killer was not just a monster. He was a phantom who could move through the city with supernatural speed and silence, killing twice in one night in 2 different police jurisdictions. The pressure on the police was now at a breaking point. It was during this period that the case took a turn that would forever define it. The Central News Agency received a letter, one of hundreds that had been sent to the police and the press by cranks and hoaxers. But this one was different. It was written in red ink and was filled with a taunting, boastful bravado. The author claimed to be the killer. He mocked the police for their inability to catch him and promised more killings to come. The letter was signed with a name that would burn itself into the public consciousness forever: Jack the Ripper. Initially, the police believed the letter was just another hoax. But then, a few days later, another piece of mail arrived. It was a postcard, also written in red ink and seemingly by the same hand. The author referred to the double event, boasting about his work. "You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow," he wrote, referring to the murders of Stride and Eddowes, because the postcard seemed to reference details of the crime before they were made public. The police began to take it seriously. They published facsimiles of the Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jackie postcard in the newspapers, hoping someone might recognize the handwriting. The publication of the letters had the opposite effect. Instead of generating useful leads, it created a media frenzy and cemented the killer's new, terrifying identity in the public mind. The name Jack the Ripper was perfect. It was catchy, menacing, and captured the brutal nature of the crimes. The killer was no longer the anonymous Whitechapel murderer. He was Jack the Ripper, a celebrity monster, the star of his own gruesome story. Another letter, known as the From Hell letter, was later sent to the leader of a local vigilance committee. It was accompanied by a small box containing half of a preserved human kidney. The author claimed it was from Catherine Eddowes, and that he had fried and ate the other half. Medical examinations of the kidney were inconclusive, but it appeared to be human and from the correct side of the body. The Ripper's final and most brutal act came on the morning of November 9, 1888. The victim was Mary Jane Kelly. At 25, she was much younger than the other victims and was described as being attractive, with blonde hair and blue eyes. She was the only one of the canonical five who was not killed on the street. She was murdered in her own small single-room lodging at 13 Miller's Court, a squalid and dilapidated room that she could barely afford. Her landlord had sent his assistant to collect her overdue rent. When she didn't answer the door, the assistant peered through a broken window pane. The scene inside was one of almost unimaginable carnage. The police were called, and they broke down the door. Mary Jane Kelly's body had been completely and systematically butchered. She was almost unrecognizable as a human being. The killer had had hours, undisturbed and in the privacy of her room, to carry out his most horrific fantasies. Her organs were removed and arranged around the room. Her face was hacked away, and her heart had been taken from the scene. It was an act of such extreme, apocalyptic violence that it seemed to be the ultimate expression of the killer's rage. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the terror stopped. After the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, the killings of Jack the Ripper ceased. The phantom who had held London in a grip of fear for an entire autumn simply vanished. The police continued their investigation, but they were no closer to finding him than they had been after the first murder. The case remained open, a permanent, unsolved stain on the record of Scotland Yard. Jack the Ripper had escaped, leaving behind only a handful of mutilated bodies, a series of taunting letters, and a legend that would grow more powerful with each passing year. The abrupt end to the Jack the Ripper murders in November of 1888 did not bring a sense of relief to London, but rather a profound and lingering sense of unease. The monster had not been caught. He had simply vanished. This silence left a vacuum that has been filled for over 130 years with endless speculation, countless theories, and a parade of potential suspects. The hunt for the identity of Jack the Ripper became a cottage industry, a historical whodunit that has captivated generations of historians, authors, and amateur detectives, known as Ripperologists. The list of potential suspects is vast and varied, ranging from the plausible to the utterly fantastic. The police at the time considered several key individuals. One of the most prominent was a man named Montague John Druitt. Druitt was a barrister and schoolteacher from a respectable family who was known to be suffering from severe depression. His body was found floating in the River Thames just a few weeks after the final murder of Mary Jane Kelly. His death was ruled a suicide. The timing was incredibly suspicious. It led some senior police officials, including Sir Melville Macnaghten, the assistant chief constable of the CID, to believe that Druitt was the Ripper. Macnaghten wrote in a private memorandum that he believed Druitt's own family suspected him of the crimes, and that his suicide was an admission of guilt. However, there was no direct evidence linking Druitt to the murders, and his own brother insisted he had a solid alibi for the night of the double event. Another suspect favored by many, including Inspector Aberline himself, was a Polish immigrant named Surin Klasowski, who went by the name George Chapman. Chapman was a deeply disturbed and violent man who was later convicted and executed for poisoning 3 of his wives. He had worked as a barber surgeon in Whitechapel at the time of the Ripper murders, giving him both the location and the potential anatomical skill. When Aberline witnessed Chapman's trial, he reportedly remarked, "You've got Jack the Ripper at last." However, Chapman's method of killing, covert poisoning, was a world away from the brutal, up-close violence of the Ripper. Most experts now believe it is psychologically unlikely that a single killer would employ two such dramatically different methods. A third police suspect was Aaron Kosminski, another Polish Jewish immigrant who worked as a hairdresser in Whitechapel. Kosminski suffered from severe mental illness and had a documented hatred of women, particularly prostitutes. He was eventually committed to a series of asylums. Macnaghten's memorandum also listed him as a strong suspect, noting that he fit the profile and lived in the heart of the murder district. In 2014, a controversial book claimed to have definitively identified Kosminski as the Ripper through DNA analysis of a shawl that was allegedly found at the scene of Catherine Eddowes's murder. However, the scientific validity of the DNA evidence has been widely and vigorously disputed by other experts, and the provenance of the shawl itself is highly questionable. Kosminski remains a compelling suspect, but the proof of his guilt is far from conclusive. Over the years, the list of suspects has expanded to include some truly outlandish theories. Some have accused a member of the royal family, Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence and grandson of Queen Victoria, of being the killer. This theory posits a grand conspiracy to cover up his crimes. Others have pointed to the famous artist Walter Sickert, suggesting he was either the Ripper himself or an accomplice, and that he embedded cryptic clues to the crimes in his paintings. There is even a theory that Jack the Ripper was not a man at all, but a woman, perhaps a midwife who had the necessary anatomical knowledge and could move through the streets of Whitechapel at night without arousing suspicion. This Jill the Ripper theory, however, is not taken seriously by most mainstream historians. The question of whether the famous "Dear Boss, Saucy Jackie" and "From Hell" letters were genuinely written by the killer is also a subject of intense debate. Many modern experts now believe that the first two letters were likely a hoax, created by a journalist at the Central News Agency to sensationalize the story and boost newspaper sales. The "From Hell" letter, with its accompanying piece of a human kidney, is considered by some to be the only potentially authentic communication from the killer, due to its grim physical evidence. But even this is not certain. The letters, whether real or fake, were instrumental in creating the enduring legend. They gave the killer a voice and a name, transforming him from a simple murderer into a cultural icon. The Jack the Ripper case was a watershed moment in the history of crime. It was one of the first major serial killer cases to play out in the international media, creating a template for the public's fascination with such crimes. It also highlighted the severe limitations of 19th-century police work and spurred major reforms in investigative techniques and the science of criminology. But for all the books, documentaries, and theories, the central mystery remains unsolved. The identity of the man who terrorized London in the autumn of 1888 is likely lost to history forever. He was a product of his environment, a phantom who emerged from the social decay and desperate poverty of Whitechapel. He preyed on the most vulnerable members of society, women whose lives were deemed so insignificant that their killer believed he could murder them with impunity. And for a time, he was right. Jack the Ripper was never caught. He was never brought to justice. He simply disappeared, leaving behind a legacy of fear, a collection of gruesome crime scene photographs, and a name that still has the power to chill the blood. He is the ultimate Victorian ghost, a figure in a top hat and cloak, emerging from the London fog with a glinting knife in his hand, a permanent and terrifying fixture in the dark, gaslit alleys of our collective nightmare. The autumn of terror may have ended, but the legend of Jack the Ripper will likely never die. The disappearance of A.C. Sonny Liston. The legend of Jack the Ripper is a story about a killer who became a phantom, his identity lost to the fog of Victorian London. But some mysteries are not about phantoms. They are about giants, larger-than-life figures who live in the brightest of spotlights, whose every move is chronicled, and yet whose final moments are shrouded in a darkness as deep as any back alley. This is a story about a man who was once the most feared athlete on the planet, a heavyweight champion of the world whose life was a brutal climb from poverty and prison to global fame. But his death was a quiet, lonely, and deeply suspicious affair, leaving behind a web of connections to organized crime, a trail of unanswered questions, and a final, confounding mystery. This is the strange and controversial death of Sonny Liston. Charles "Sonny" Liston was a force of nature, born into a desperately poor family of sharecroppers in rural Arkansas. He was one of 25 children. His early life was one of unremitting hardship and brutality. He never learned to read or write properly and fled to St. Louis as a young man to escape the backbreaking labor of the fields and the violent abuse of his father. But trouble followed him. He was a huge, physically intimidating young man, and he quickly fell into a life of crime. He was arrested for armed robbery and sentenced to prison, and it was there, in the Missouri State Penitentiary, that he discovered the one thing that would change his life: boxing. Liston was a natural. He had immense physical power, a devastating jab, and an aura of sheer menace that terrified his opponents before they even stepped into the ring. When he was paroled, his boxing contract was effectively owned by the mob. His career was managed by notorious St. Louis and Philadelphia crime figures who saw him as a cash cow. He climbed the heavyweight ranks through a series of brutal, often lightning-fast knockouts. He was the man no one wanted to fight. His scowling, intimidating presence and his deep ties to organized crime made him the ultimate boxing villain, the bad guy that the respectable boxing establishment wanted nothing to do with. But his talent was undeniable. In 1962, he got his shot at the title against the reigning champion, Floyd Patterson. Patterson was the good champion, a clean-living man embraced by the mainstream. The boxing world was horrified at the prospect of a mob-controlled ex-convict like Liston holding the most prestigious title in sports. But in the ring, none of that mattered. Liston destroyed Patterson, knocking him out in the first round to become the heavyweight champion of the world. For a brief time, Sonny Liston was on top of the world. He was the baddest man on the planet. But his reign was short-lived. In 1964, he was challenged by a young, charismatic, and fast-talking fighter from Louisville named Cassius Clay. Clay was a massive underdog. The boxing world expected Liston to demolish him. But in a stunning upset, Clay, who would soon change his name to Muhammad Ali, defeated Liston when Liston refused to come out for the 7th round, claiming a shoulder injury. A year later, in their rematch, the fight ended even more controversially. Just minutes into the first round, Ali threw a short, seemingly harmless punch that sent the giant Liston crashing to the canvas. It became known as the Phantom Punch, and many still believe to this day that Liston took a dive, that the fight was fixed by the mob. That second loss to Ali effectively ended Liston's time at the top. He was seen as a washed-up has-been, a pawn of the mob who had taken a fall. He continued to fight, but he was no longer the main event. In the late 1960s, seeking a quieter life and a place where his past wouldn't haunt him as much, he moved to Las Vegas. Las Vegas in the late 1960s and early 70s was a city run by the mob. The casinos, the entertainment, the money, it was all controlled by powerful crime families. For Sonny Liston, a man who had spent his entire career entangled with the underworld, it was a natural fit. He bought a comfortable home in a quiet, affluent neighborhood. He was still a celebrity, a familiar face in the casinos, but he was trying to keep a lower profile. He was still fighting professionally, but he was also rumored to be working as an enforcer and a debt collector for his old mob associates, using his still intimidating presence to collect on loan-sharking debts. He was also, according to many sources, involved in the local drug scene, not just as a user, but potentially as a dealer. Sonny Liston was a man living in a dangerous world, juggling a complex web of connections to powerful and violent people. He knew things, he had seen things, and in the world of organized crime, knowing too much can be a fatal liability. The story of his death begins in late December of 1970. His wife, Geraldine, had been out of town visiting her mother for the holidays. She tried to call Sonny several times over the New Year's weekend, but he never answered the phone. This was unusual, but she wasn't immediately alarmed, assuming he was out with friends. She returned to their Las Vegas home on the evening of January 5, 1971. When she arrived, she was met with a strange and ominous scene. The newspapers were piled up on the front porch. The mail was overflowing from the mailbox. A strange, unpleasant odor was coming from inside the house. Using her key, she opened the front door and was hit by the smell, which she later described as like sour, spoiled food. The house was dark and quiet. She called out for Sonny, but there was no answer. She walked through the house and up the stairs to their master bedroom. The door was closed. She opened it and was met by a horrific sight. Lying on the bed at the foot of it was the body of Sonny Liston. He was wearing only a pair of boxer shorts. He was clearly deceased and had been for some time. The room was in order with no signs of a struggle. On the nightstand next to the bed, police would find a small amount of heroin and a syringe. Geraldine immediately ran from the house and called the police. The Las Vegas Police Department arrived to find a scene that, on the surface, seemed straightforward. They had a known heroin user, a man with a history of hard living, found dead in his bedroom with drug paraphernalia nearby. The immediate assumption was that Sonny Liston had died of a heroin overdose. The coroner's report would eventually list the official cause of death as lung congestion and heart failure, with a note that a heroin overdose was the likely, but not definitively proven, cause. The case was officially closed. But for those who knew Sonny Liston, this explanation never made any sense. It was a neat and tidy conclusion to a messy and complicated life, but it was riddled with contradictions and unanswered questions. The first and most significant problem was Sonny's well-known and profound fear of needles. He was famously, almost comically, terrified of them. He would refuse routine blood tests and flu shots. The idea that this man would willingly and competently administer his own intravenous heroin injection seemed completely out of character, if not impossible. Friends and trainers insisted he would never have used a needle on himself or anyone else. The scene itself also had strange inconsistencies. While there was drug paraphernalia on the nightstand, there were no spoons, lighters, or tourniquets, the necessary tools for cooking and injecting heroin. And while the autopsy did find trace amounts of morphine, a byproduct of heroin, in his system, the levels were not high enough to be conclusively ruled a fatal overdose. Furthermore, there were no fresh needle marks on his body. The police did find one recent puncture mark on his arm, but it was not the track-marked arm of a regular intravenous drug user. These inconsistencies led to a much darker and more sinister theory, that Sonny Liston had not died of an accidental overdose, but that he had been murdered. The theory posits that he was the victim of a hot shot, a deliberately induced fatal overdose administered by someone else, and that the scene was staged to look like a typical junkie's death. This would be a quiet, clean way to eliminate a man who had become a problem, a murder that could easily be dismissed as just another sad casualty of the Las Vegas lifestyle. The question then became, who would want Sonny Liston dead, and why? The list of potential suspects was long and filled with some of the most dangerous men in the country. Sonny was swimming in a sea of sharks, mobsters, drug dealers, and powerful figures who could not afford to have their secrets revealed. Had the man who had lived by a code of violent intimidation finally become a victim of it himself? The investigation into his death had been closed, but for many, the mystery of who or what had really killed the baddest man on the planet was just beginning. The official ruling that Sonny Liston had died of a self-administered heroin overdose was met with immediate and widespread skepticism, particularly from those who knew him best. The narrative of a lonely, accidental death simply did not align with the man they knew, nor did it account for the numerous strange and contradictory details of the case. As the official investigation closed, an unofficial one began in the court of public opinion and among investigative journalists, one that explored the much more likely and far more sinister possibility of murder. The central pillar of the murder theory was Liston's profound and well-documented fear of needles. His former trainer, Johnny Taco, was one of the most vocal proponents of this view. He stated unequivocally that Liston would never have gone near a syringe. He wouldn't even go to a doctor for a checkup, for fear of getting a shot, Taco told reporters. This wasn't just a mild dislike. It was a full-blown phobia. The idea that this man would have the knowledge and the nerve to prepare and inject his own heroin was, to his friends, laughable. This suggested that if he did die from an overdose, the drug must have been administered by someone else, either by force or by deception. The forensic evidence, or lack thereof, also supported the murder theory. The police found no fingerprints on the syringe or the other drug paraphernalia found at the scene. This was highly unusual. A person administering their own injection, particularly a novice, would almost certainly leave prints. The absence of prints suggested that the scene had been wiped clean, a classic sign of a staged crime scene. Furthermore, the amount of heroin byproduct found in his system was relatively low. While it could have been enough to kill him, especially if he was not a regular user, it was not the massive, undeniable overdose that one would expect to see in a clear-cut case. This led to the theory that he may have been forced to ingest the drug orally, or that he was killed by other means and the heroin was planted at the scene as misdirection. If Sonny Liston was murdered, the list of potential suspects was a veritable who's who of the American underworld. He was a man with a foot in many dangerous worlds, and any one of them could have provided a motive for his elimination. One of the leading theories points to his connections to the Las Vegas drug trade. In the months leading up to his death, there were persistent rumors that Liston was not just using drugs, but was also involved in dealing them. He was allegedly working with a crew of dealers who were known to be violent and well-connected. One theory suggests that Liston was planning to get out of the drug game and was demanding a final, large payout from his associates. Fearing he knew too much and could expose their operation, they decided to silence him permanently. Another variation of this theory suggests that a rival drug trafficking organization wanted to move in on his crew's territory and eliminated Liston as a way of sending a message. A more specific and compelling theory involves a high-profile drug bust that was being planned by federal law enforcement. According to some sources, Liston had become a target of this investigation. It is possible that he had been approached by federal agents and was considering becoming an informant in exchange for immunity. For his dangerous associates in the drug world, a man of Liston's stature turning informant would be a catastrophic betrayal. His murder, in this context, would have been a preemptive strike to ensure his silence. Another powerful motive leads back to the world that had defined his entire career: boxing and the mob. The infamous Phantom Punch fight against Muhammad Ali in 1965 had always been a source of speculation. Many believe that Liston, under pressure from his mob handlers, had deliberately thrown the fight for a massive betting payday. In the years that followed, Liston was allegedly haunted by the event and had begun to talk more openly about it, particularly when he was drinking. He was a walking, talking liability, a man who could expose the deep corruption at the heart of the sport. One of the most powerful and feared mob figures connected to Liston was Meyer Lansky's right-hand man, Mo Dalitz, a key figure in the Las Vegas casino world. There is a persistent theory that Liston was about to be subpoenaed to testify before a Senate committee that was investigating organized crime's influence in professional boxing. Liston's testimony could have implicated some of the most powerful figures in the country. His sudden death, just before he could potentially testify, was seen by many as suspiciously convenient. In the world of the mob, a man who knows too much and talks too much often meets a quiet, unexplained end. An overdose, either real or staged, was a classic method for a mob hit, as it was often dismissed by the authorities as just another sad consequence of a hard life. The circumstances of the discovery of his body also raised questions. His wife, Geraldine, returned home on January 5th. Based on the state of decomposition and the pile of newspapers, police estimated he had been dead for at least 5 or 6 days, placing his time of death around December 30th. Why did it take so long for anyone to notice he was missing? Sonny Liston was still a major celebrity in Las Vegas. He had friends, business associates, and people who checked on him regularly. The fact that no one seemed to have seen or heard from him for nearly a week was strange. It suggested that perhaps those who knew what had happened were deliberately staying away, allowing enough time to pass for the scene to become contaminated and for the true cause of death to become obscured. The police investigation itself was also criticized for being cursory and incomplete. Once the initial ruling of a probable overdose was made, the case was quickly closed. The police did not seem to be interested in pursuing the more complex and dangerous possibility of a mob-related homicide. In the Las Vegas of that era, it was often easier and safer for the police to accept the simplest explanation, especially when the alternative involved taking on powerful and dangerous criminal organizations. The official narrative was neat and tidy, and it required no one to ask any difficult questions. The mystery of Sonny Liston's death is a story about the brutal collision of sports, celebrity, and organized crime. He was a man who was created by the mob, controlled by the mob, and quite possibly ultimately destroyed by the mob. He was a pawn in their game from the very beginning, a powerful tool used to make money and exert influence. When he was no longer useful or when he became a liability, he was simply discarded. His life was a study in tragedy. He was a man of immense physical gifts but was denied the education and the opportunities to build a life outside of violence. He rose to the very pinnacle of his sport, only to have his legacy forever tainted by accusations of corruption. He tried to escape his past by moving to Las Vegas, but he only ended up diving deeper into the very world that had always controlled him. The question of who killed Sonny Liston is likely unanswerable. The list of potential suspects is long, and most of them are now dead themselves, their secrets buried with them. But the evidence strongly suggests that his death was not the quiet, lonely accident that the official record states. It was the final, violent chapter in a life that was defined by violence. The man who had terrified so many in the ring had finally met someone, or something, that he could not beat. The official cause of death may be listed as heart failure, but it is far more likely that Sonny Liston's heart was stopped by the dangerous secrets he kept. The death of Sonny Liston remains one of the most enduring and debated mysteries in the history of sports. While the official file may be closed, the case continues to be a subject of intense fascination, a dark fable about the price of fame and the inescapable reach of the criminal underworld. The legacy of his death is not one of closure, but of a permanent, nagging question mark that hangs over his otherwise remarkable life. In the years following his death, the murder theory has only gained more traction as journalists and authors have continued to dig into the circumstances surrounding his final days. New witnesses have come forward, and old stories have been re-examined, all of which point away from an accidental overdose and toward a deliberate act of murder. One of the most compelling accounts comes from a man named Larry Gandy, a former Las Vegas police officer turned author. Gandy claims to have information from confidential informants that directly implicates a notorious drug dealer who was known to be an associate of Liston. According to Gandy's theory, Liston had become a problem for this drug trafficking operation. He was either demanding a larger share of the profits or was threatening to expose them. A meeting was arranged at Liston's home. It was at this meeting that the drug dealer, along with an accomplice, forced Liston to take a fatal dose of heroin. The theory suggests that they may have held him down while one of them administered the injection, which would explain the single, fresh puncture mark found on his arm and his famous fear of needles. The scene was then wiped clean and staged to look like a solo overdose. Another powerful voice that has kept the murder theory alive is that of one of Liston's own sons, who has publicly stated for years that he believes his father was murdered by the mob. He has pointed to the many inconsistencies in the official story and has spoken of his father's deep connections to dangerous people, including figures involved in the casino and entertainment industries. He believes his father's death was a contract hit, ordered by powerful men who feared what Sonny might say. The theory connecting his death to his potential testimony before a Senate committee also remains a strong possibility. In the early 1970s, the government was cracking down on organized crime's influence in professional sports. Sonny Liston, as the former heavyweight champion whose career was openly managed by mob figures, would have been a star witness. He had first-hand knowledge of fight fixing, illegal betting, and the corrupt underbelly of the sport. His testimony could have sent powerful men to prison for a very long time. In the brutal calculus of the mob, the risk of allowing him to testify would have been far too great. His death, just before he could potentially be subpoenaed, fits a classic pattern of witness elimination. The final, tragic irony of Sonny Liston's life is that he spent his entire career being portrayed as a monster, an unstoppable force of brutal intimidation. He was the villain, the big ugly bear, the man that America loved to hate. But in the end, it seems he was the one who was intimidated, the one who was ultimately cornered and destroyed by forces far more monstrous than he ever was. He was a man who was trapped by his own past, unable to escape the criminal world that had both built him up and torn him down. His funeral was a quiet and somber affair, a stark contrast to the massive crowds and media frenzy that had surrounded his championship fights. A few old boxing friends and his family were there to say goodbye. He was buried in Paradise Memorial Gardens in Las Vegas. His gravestone is a simple, flat plaque bearing his name and the epitaph, "A man, It is a fittingly stoic and understated tribute to a man whose life was anything but simple. The case of Sonny Liston serves as a dark cautionary tale about the intersection of sports and crime. It highlights a period in American history when organized crime had its tentacles wrapped deeply around the world of professional boxing, an influence that corrupted the sport and often destroyed the lives of the fighters it controlled. Liston was both a beneficiary and a victim of this system. It gave him a path out of poverty, but it was a path from which there was no exit. Today, the official record still reads that he died of an overdose, but very few people who have seriously studied the case believe it. The evidence, both circumstantial and anecdotal, points overwhelmingly to murder. The lack of a formal investigation at the time means that the truth is likely lost forever. The crime scene was not properly preserved. Key witnesses were never thoroughly interrogated, and the most powerful suspects were never seriously pursued. Sonny Liston's legacy remains a complicated one. In the boxing ring, he is remembered as one of the most intimidating and powerful heavyweights of all time, a wrecking ball with a devastating jab. But outside the ring, his story is a tragedy. He was an uneducated man from the poorest depths of the Jim Crow South who rose to the highest peak of celebrity, only to find that he could never outrun the demons of his past or the dangerous men who controlled his destiny. The mystery of his death is the final, unanswered question in a life full of them. Was he killed by drug dealers he had double-crossed? Was he silenced by the mob before he could testify? Or was he simply a lonely man who succumbed to his own addictions? The truth lies buried with him in that Las Vegas cemetery. The man who lived his life in the harsh glare of the public spotlight died alone in a dark room, leaving behind a mystery that perfectly encapsulates the brutal and secretive world he could never escape. He was, in the end, just a man, a giant brought down by a world that was far more savage than he ever was. The murders at the Lake Bodom, the suspicious death of Sonny Liston, is a story about the dark side of celebrity, a mystery that played out in the glitzy, mob-controlled world of Las Vegas. But some of the most enduring and terrifying crimes happen far from the glare of the public eye, in places of natural beauty and youthful innocence. This is a story that takes place not in a boxing ring, but at a tranquil lakeside campsite. It's a story about a night of teenage fun that was shattered by an act of explosive, savage violence, leaving behind a lone, traumatized survivor and a nation's most infamous and haunting unsolved crime. This is the story of the Lake Bodom murders. Finland, in the early summer of 1960, was a nation known for its vast, pristine forests, its thousands of lakes, and its peaceful, reserved culture. It was a place where people felt a deep connection to nature, and where camping was a cherished national pastime. Lake Bodom, located just outside the city of Espoo, was a popular spot for just such an activity. It was a beautiful, serene lake, surrounded by woods, a perfect, idyllic setting for a weekend getaway. On Saturday, June 4th, 1960, 4 teenagers decided to take advantage of the long, bright Nordic evening by camping on the shores of the lake. The group consisted of 2 15-year-old girls, Mila Ermeli Björklund and Anya Talikimäki, and their 2 18-year-old boyfriends, Seppo and Tero Boiman and Nils Wilhelm Gustafsson. They were just a typical group of friends, excited for a night of camping, swimming, and teenage romance. They rode their motorcycles to a quiet, secluded spot on the southern shore of the lake and set up their single, small tent. The evening was, by all accounts, a normal one. They went for a swim, talked, and likely shared a few drinks. As the long twilight finally faded into the brief Nordic night, they all retired to their tent to sleep. The 2 couples were sharing the small space, a scene of innocent, youthful intimacy. It was the last peaceful moment they would ever have. What happened in the pre-dawn hours of Sunday, June 5th, is a matter of terrifying uncertainty, pieced together from forensic evidence and the fragmented memories of the lone survivor. Sometime between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m., while the 4 teenagers were asleep in their tent, an unknown assailant or assailants launched a brutal and savage attack. The attack was not carried out from inside the tent. The killer did not unzip the flap and enter. Instead, they attacked from the outside, using a blunt object, likely a large rock or a pipe, and a sharp knife. They began to stab and bludgeon the teenagers through the thin fabric of the tent itself. It was an act of indiscriminate, frenzied violence. The teenagers, roused from their sleep into a nightmare of pain and confusion, were trapped inside the collapsing tent, unable to see their attacker or properly defend themselves. The assault was quick and horrifically effective. Mila Bjorklund, Anya Maki, and Seppo Boiman were all killed in the onslaught. They died from a combination of stab wounds and massive blunt force trauma to their heads. The killer had acted with an almost inhuman level of rage, but one of them survived. Nils Gustafsson, who had been sleeping next to his girlfriend, Mila, was also severely beaten. He suffered a concussion, fractures to his jaw and facial bones, and numerous bruises, but somehow he survived the attack. He would later be found lying on top of the collapsed tent, dazed, confused, and with no clear memory of the event that had just taken the lives of his 3 friends. The horrific crime was not discovered for several hours. Around 11 a.m., a group of boys who were bird-watching nearby saw the collapsed tent from a distance. They saw a man with blonde hair walking away from the scene, but they were too far away to get a clear look or identify him. Thinking it was just a campsite that had been left in a mess, they didn't approach. It wasn't until around noon that a local man, out for a walk, stumbled upon the gruesome scene up close. He saw the blood-soaked tent and the bodies and immediately alerted the police. When the authorities arrived, they were met with a scene of absolute carnage. The 3 dead teenagers were still inside the collapsed, shredded tent. Nils Gustafsson was outside, conscious but in a state of profound shock. The initial police investigation was chaotic and, by modern standards, deeply flawed. The crime scene was not properly secured. Dozens of police officers, and even curious onlookers, tramped through the area, potentially destroying crucial evidence. The police failed to conduct a thorough search of the surrounding woods for the murder weapons, which were never found. This initial mishandling of the crime scene would haunt the investigation for decades. The police were faced with a crime that seemed to have no motive. There was no evidence of robbery. The teenagers' wallets and belongings, including their motorcycles, were all still at the scene. There was no clear evidence of sexual assault, though the nature of the wounds on Mila Bjorklund, who was found partially undressed and had been stabbed more viciously than the others, suggested a possible sexual motivation or a particular rage directed at her. The most critical piece of evidence was the lone survivor, Nils Gustafsson, but he was in no condition to help. He claimed to have no memory of the attack itself. He remembered the camping trip, the swimming, and going to sleep, but the moments of the attack were a complete blank, a condition that doctors attributed to the severe head trauma he had sustained. His memory was a locked room, and the police were unable to find the key. In the absence of a coherent witness, the police were left to chase down a series of strange and often contradictory leads. One of the first and most enduring suspects was a man who ran a small kiosk near the lake. He was known to have a deep-seated hatred for campers, who he felt were trespassing on his property and disrupting his peace. He had been seen acting aggressively towards other campers in the past. Several people claimed that on his deathbed years later, he had confessed to the murders. However, his wife provided him with an alibi for the night of the killings, stating he was asleep in bed with her. The confession was never verified, and he was never charged. Another theory centered on a mysterious man known as the man from the mortuary. A doctor at a nearby hospital reported that a few days after the murders, a German man who worked at the hospital had shown up for work with dirt under his fingernails and acting suspiciously nervous. This man had a history of violent behavior. The police investigated him, but he too had an alibi. The investigation also looked into a man named Hans Assmann, an alleged KGB spy who lived in the area. An author later claimed that Assmann had confessed to the murders, but like the other confessions, it was never substantiated. The case of the Lake Boda murders became Finland's most infamous and chilling unsolved crime. It was a story of unimaginable brutality erupting in a place of serene, natural beauty. The image of the 4 teenagers, asleep in their tent, being attacked by a faceless monster from the outside, tapped into a primal fear. The killer was a phantom, a man who had emerged from the Finnish woods, committed an act of unspeakable violence, and then disappeared back into the forest without a trace. The case went cold for over 40 years, a permanent open wound in the nation's psyche. But the story was far from over. Decades later, a new development, fueled by advances in forensic science, would bring the case roaring back to life, and the investigation would turn its focus onto the one person no one had ever truly suspected. The lone survivor, Nils Gustafsson himself. For more than 4 decades, the Lake Bodom murders remained frozen in time, a chilling piece of Finnish folklore and a testament to a perfect, unsolved crime. The case was a national trauma, a story passed down through generations, its central mystery, the identity of the faceless killer who emerged from the woods, only deepening with the passage of time. The lone survivor, Nils Gustafsson, went on to live a normal, quiet life. He recovered from his physical injuries, though he always maintained that he had no memory of the actual attack, a convenient and impenetrable shield of amnesia. He married, had a family, and worked as a bus driver. To the public, he was the tragic final victim of the massacre, the boy who had miraculously survived a nightmare that had claimed his 3 friends. The case files gathered dust, and it seemed the truth of what happened on that June morning in 1960 would be buried forever. But the advent of modern forensic science, particularly DNA analysis, offered a new hope for cracking even the coldest of cases. In the early 2000s, the Finnish National Bureau of Investigation decided to reopen the Lake Bodom case, hoping that new technology could reveal clues that were invisible in 1960. They meticulously re-examined the physical evidence that had been preserved from the crime scene, including the blood-soaked tent and the victim's clothing. The new investigation began to focus on a detail that had always been puzzling: the victim's shoes. The shoes of the 3 deceased teenagers were found inside the tent, neatly placed. But Nils Gustafsson's shoes were not. They were found several hundred yards away from the campsite, partially hidden in the woods. Also found with his shoes was a pillowcase from the tent. Forensic analysis of these shoes in the 2000s yielded a stunning result. The outside of the shoes had traces of the victim's blood, which was to be expected given the chaotic scene. But the inside of the shoes had no traces of the victim's blood at all. This suggested that Gustafsson had not been wearing the shoes during the attack. This discovery was the linchpin for a radical new theory of the crime. Investigators began to piece together a new narrative, one that completely upended the 44-year-old story. They theorized that there had been no mysterious outside attacker. The killer had been inside the tent all along. Their new prime suspect was the lone survivor himself, Nils Gustafsson. In March of 2004, the nation of Finland was stunned when the National Bureau of Investigation announced that, after a 44-year cold case investigation, they were arresting a suspect for the Lake Bodom murders. That suspect was the 61-year-old Nils Gustafsson. The man who had been seen as the tragic final victim was now being accused of being the perpetrator of the entire horrific crime. The prosecution laid out their case, a circumstantial but compelling reconstruction of the events of that night. They argued that a fight had broken out inside the tent between Gustafsson and his friend, Seppo Boiman. The motive, they suggested, was jealousy. An eyewitness from that day, a woman who had been at the lake, came forward with a new statement. She claimed she had seen Gustafsson and Boiman arguing heatedly earlier in the evening. The prosecution theorized that this argument had escalated later in the night. Perhaps it was a dispute over one of the girls, likely Mila Björklund, who was Gustafsson's girlfriend but who may have been showing attention to Seppo. According to the prosecution's theory, the argument erupted into a violent, drunken rage. Gustafsson, in a fit of fury, attacked and killed his friend Seppo. He then turned his rage on the 2 girls, Anjamaki and his own girlfriend, Mila, murdering them to eliminate all witnesses. After the frenzy of violence was over, he exited the tent and, in a calculated move to conceal his guilt, he inflicted a series of injuries upon himself to make it appear as though he was also a victim. He then took off his shoes, which were presumably covered in the victim's blood, and walked a considerable distance into the woods to hide them, hoping they would never be found. He then returned to the campsite and laid down on top of the tent, feigning amnesia, waiting to be discovered. This theory, while shocking, seemed to explain many of the puzzling aspects of the case. It explained the lack of an outside intruder. It explained the killer's seemingly intimate knowledge of the victims. And it provided a motive, jealousy, and rage for a crime that had always seemed motiveless. The DNA evidence found on Gustafsson's shoes was presented as the key. The blood of the 3 victims was found on the outside of the shoes, but Gustafsson's own blood was not. This, the prosecution argued, proved that he had not been wearing the shoes when he was attacked, but that he had put them on after the murders, gotten the victims' blood on them, and then had taken them off to hide them. The prosecution also pointed to a cryptic statement Gustafsson had allegedly made to a police officer shortly after the crime, while he was still in the hospital. The officer claimed that Gustafsson had said, "What's done is done," a phrase that could be interpreted as a fatalistic admission of guilt. The trial of Nils Gustafsson began in 2005 and became a national media spectacle. The entire country was captivated by the courtroom drama. The man who had been a symbol of survival was now on trial for mass murder. The prosecution presented its case, based on the DNA evidence from the shoes, the eyewitness account of the argument, and the theory of a jealous rage. They painted a picture of a teenage boy who had committed an act of unspeakable violence and had then cleverly and successfully hidden his guilt for over 4 decades, living a quiet life while harboring a monstrous secret. Gustafsson's defense team, however, mounted a powerful counterargument. They attacked every piece of the prosecution's circumstantial case. They argued that the eyewitness account of an argument was unreliable, coming 44 years after the event. They pointed out that if Gustafsson had been in a violent rage, his own injuries were far too severe to have been self-inflicted. He had suffered a broken jaw and facial fractures, injuries that were more consistent with a genuine, brutal assault than with self-mutilation. How could a man, even in a frenzy, inflict such serious injuries on himself? The defense also had a different interpretation of the DNA evidence. They argued that the lack of Gustafsson's blood on the outside of his shoes was not proof of guilt, but was simply a result of the limitations of the evidence. They suggested that the blood had likely washed away over the years. They also pointed to the fact that DNA from an unknown 4th male, not belonging to Gustafsson or Boisman, was also found at the scene, pointing to the existence of an outside attacker. The defense also brought up the testimony of the boys who had been birdwatching that morning. They had reported seeing a blond man walking away from the campsite. Nils Gustafsson did not have blonde hair. This seemed to support the presence of an unknown outsider. The core of the defense was simple. The police had botched the original investigation so badly that it was now impossible to determine what had really happened. They had failed to secure the crime scene, had lost or contaminated evidence, and had failed to pursue credible leads, like the kiosk keeper. The defense argued that the police, frustrated by their inability to solve the case for 4 decades, were now trying to pin the crime on the only person they had left, the convenient, amnesiac survivor. They were turning a victim into a scapegoat. The trial became a battle of competing narratives. Was Nils Gustafsson a cunning killer who had fooled an entire nation for over 40 years? Or was he a tragic victim, a man who had not only lost his friends and the love of his youth in a horrific attack, but was now being unjustly accused of the crime himself? The jury was faced with a difficult task: to look back across a chasm of 4 decades and try to find the truth in a case that was built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence and interpretation. The fate of Nils Gustafsson, and the final chapter of Finland's most enduring mystery, now rested in their hands. The trial of Nils Gustafsson was a national spectacle, a courtroom drama that had the entire country of Finland holding its breath. The prosecution's case rested on a chain of circumstantial evidence: the DNA on the shoes, the alleged argument, the cryptic hospital statement, and the psychological theory of a jealous rage. They painted Gustafsson as a cunning sociopath, a man capable of committing a horrific act of violence and then living a quiet, unremarkable life for 44 years, his dark secret perfectly concealed behind a mask of trauma and amnesia. The defense, in turn, systematically dismantled the prosecution's narrative. They argued that Gustafsson's injuries, particularly the fractured jaw, were too severe and too specific to be self-inflicted. They presented expert medical testimony suggesting that such injuries would have been incredibly difficult for a person to inflict upon themselves with any degree of control. They emphasized the presence of the unidentified male DNA at the scene, arguing that this was definitive proof of an outside attacker, the true phantom of the lake that the original investigation had always assumed. The defense also focused heavily on the botched initial police work. They argued that the contamination of the crime scene in 1960 had made it impossible to ever know the full truth. Evidence was lost, witnesses were not properly interviewed, and promising leads were not thoroughly pursued. They contended that the entire case against Gustafsson was built on a foundation of speculation, an attempt by a new generation of investigators to close the books on an embarrassing and high-profile cold case by targeting the most convenient and well-known figure associated with it. One of the most powerful moments of the trial came when Gustafsson himself, now a frail-looking man in his 60s, took the stand. He spoke in a quiet, steady voice, maintaining, as he had for over 4 decades, that he had no memory of the attack. He described his friends, his girlfriend Mila, and the happy, innocent camping trip. He recounted waking up on top of the tent, confused, in pain, and surrounded by a scene of unimaginable horror. His testimony was either the performance of a lifetime from a cold-blooded killer, or the genuine, heartbreaking account of a man who had survived an unspeakable trauma. The jury was left to decide which it was. After a lengthy trial, the jury began its deliberations. The fate of Nils Gustafsson and the official answer to Finland's greatest murder mystery hung in the balance. On October 7, 2005, the verdict was delivered. The court found Nils Gustafsson not guilty of all charges. The acquittal was based on several key factors. The prosecution had failed to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The evidence was deemed too circumstantial, and the defense had successfully raised significant doubts about the viability of the self-inflicted injury theory and the interpretation of the DNA evidence. The court ruled that the evidence was insufficient to overturn the original assumption that an unknown outside attacker had been responsible for the crime. Nils Gustafsson walked out of the courthouse a free man, legally exonerated but forever linked to the tragedy. The verdict was met with a mixed reaction from the Finnish public. For some, it was a just outcome, a vindication for a man they had always seen as a victim. For others, it was a profound disappointment, a feeling that a killer had, for a second time, gotten away with murder. The acquittal had the effect of returning the case to its original state, a complete and utter mystery. With Gustafsson cleared, the identity of the Lake Bodom killer once again became the subject of speculation. The old suspects were re-examined. The kiosk keeper, Carl Valdemar Gillström, who had allegedly confessed on his deathbed, remains a popular candidate in the court of public opinion. His known hatred of campers and his history of aggressive behavior make him a plausible suspect. His wife's alibi, some argue, could have been false, an attempt to protect her husband. The other figures, like the mysterious man from the mortuary or the alleged KGB spy Hans Assmann, also continue to be subjects of debate in online forums and true crime communities. But with no new evidence, they remain little more than ghosts in the narrative, figures of suspicion with no concrete proof to tie them to the crime. The Lake Bodom murders have left a permanent scar on the Finnish national consciousness. The case represents a loss of innocence, a moment when the belief in the safety and tranquility of the nation's beloved natural landscapes was shattered. The image of the blood-soaked tent on the serene shores of the lake is a powerful and disturbing symbol of that loss. The story has inspired countless books, documentaries, and even a popular Finnish heavy metal band named Children of Bodom. It has become a part of the country's dark folklore, a real-life horror story that is as famous as any ancient myth. The lake itself has become a site of morbid tourism, a place where people come to feel a chill and stand on the ground where one of history's most brutal and baffling crimes occurred. Ultimately, the mystery of the Lake Bodom murders endures because every single theory has a fatal flaw. If it was an outside attacker, who was he, and what was his motive? How did he manage to commit such a frenzied and violent act and then disappear without a trace, never to be caught? If it was Nils Gustafsson, how did he inflict such severe injuries upon himself? And what was the true nature of the explosive rage that led him to murder his 3 friends? including the girl he supposedly loved? The truth of what happened in that small tent in the pre-dawn hours of June 5, 1960, is likely known only to two people. The killer, who, if not Gustafsson, almost certainly took his secret to the grave, and the lone survivor, whose memories are either genuinely lost to trauma or are buried under a lifetime of carefully constructed denial. The case is a perfect, chilling enigma. A story that offers no easy answers, no satisfying conclusion, and no justice for the three teenagers who went camping on a summer night and never came home. The silence from the shores of Lake Bodom is absolute. A permanent, haunting tribute to a mystery that will likely never be solved. The case of the lost colony of Roanoke, the murders at Lake Bodom, are a story about a single, violent night that left behind a permanent mystery. But some mysteries are not about a single night. They are about years of silence, about an entire community that seemingly vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind only a single, cryptic clue carved into a tree. This is not just a cold case. It is the original American mystery, a story that has haunted the imagination for over 400 years. It's a story of hope, hardship, and a disappearance so complete that it has become a foundational myth of a nation. This is the story of the lost colony of Roanoke. The story begins in the late 16th century, during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. England was a nation with grand ambitions, eager to challenge the dominance of Spain in the New World. Sir Walter Raleigh, a charismatic courtier and explorer, was granted a royal charter to establish the first permanent English colony in North America. The goal was to create a foothold, a base for English privateering against Spanish treasure fleets, and a source of new resources for the crown. It was a venture fueled by a mixture of national pride, greed, and a genuine spirit of adventure. In 1587, after a couple of earlier, failed attempts at establishing a military outpost, Raleigh organized a new kind of expedition. This one would not be just soldiers and sailors. It would be a true colony, comprised of families, men, women, and children who would build a permanent settlement. He chose a man named John White, an artist and cartographer who had been on a previous expedition, to be the governor of this new colony. The expedition, consisting of over 115 colonists, set sail from England in 3 ships. Their intended destination was the Chesapeake Bay, a location that was deemed more sheltered and promising than the previous site on Roanoke Island, off the coast of modern-day North Carolina. But from the very beginning, the voyage was plagued by misfortune and conflict. The pilot of the lead ship, a man named Simon Fernandez, was in a hurry. He had his own privateering interests and was eager to get back to the Caribbean to hunt for Spanish ships. When the fleet arrived at Roanoke Island to check on a small garrison that had been left behind from a previous expedition, Fernandez refused to sail any further. He insisted that the season was too late and that it was too dangerous to continue on to the Chesapeake. He essentially forced John White and the colonists to disembark at Roanoke, a place they knew was not ideal. It was a low-lying, sandy island, difficult to defend and with limited resources. But they had no choice. They were stranded, hundreds of miles from their intended destination, with the vast, unknown American continent on one side and the treacherous Atlantic Ocean on the other. Despite the difficult start, the colonists set about trying to build a new life. They repaired the small fort and the cottages that had been left behind by the previous expedition. They tried to reestablish friendly relations with the local Native American tribes, but their efforts were met with suspicion and hostility. The previous English expeditions had been brutal, and the local tribes, particularly the Croatan, had not forgotten. Tensions escalated when one of the colonists was killed by a local warrior while out crabbing alone. In the midst of this uncertainty and hardship, a moment of hope arrived. On August 18, 1587, John White's daughter, Eleanor Dare, gave birth to a baby girl. She was named Virginia Dare. She was the first English child to be born in the New World, a symbol of a new beginning, a fragile promise of a future for the colony. But the colony's situation was precarious. Their supplies were dwindling rapidly, and with the growing hostility of the local tribes, they knew they could not survive the coming winter without help. The colonists pleaded with their governor, John White, to return to England to gather more supplies and reinforcements. White was deeply reluctant to leave. He had just become a grandfather, and he did not want to abandon his family and his colony. But he was their leader, and it was his duty. He finally agreed. Before he left, he and the colonists established a plan. If they were forced to move from their settlement due to an attack or some other emergency, they would carve the name of their new location into a tree. If they were in distress when they left, they would carve a Maltese cross above the name. With this plan in place, John White sailed for England in late August of 1587, promising to return as quickly as possible. He left behind 115 people, including his daughter, his son-in-law, and his infant granddaughter, Virginia Dare. It was the last time he or any European would ever see them again. John White's journey back to England was the beginning of a long and agonizing series of delays. When he arrived, he found a nation in a state of crisis. England was preparing for a massive naval war with Spain. The Great Spanish Armada was assembling, and Queen Elizabeth I had commanded that every available ship be commandeered for the war effort. No ships were to be spared for a resupply mission to a tiny, distant colony. White was frantic. He pleaded with Sir Walter Raleigh and with the Queen herself, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. The fate of England was at stake, and the fate of 115 colonists in the New World was a secondary concern. For 3 long, agonizing years, John White was trapped in England, haunted by the thought of his family and his colony, starving and alone on the other side of the world. It wasn't until 1590 that he was finally able to secure passage on a privateering expedition that agreed to make a stop at Roanoke. After a long and difficult voyage, he finally arrived back at the island in August, almost 3 years to the day after he had left. As his ship approached the shore, he saw a column of smoke rising from the island, a sign he hoped was from the colonists. He and his landing party rowed ashore, filled with a desperate, hopeful anticipation. As they approached the settlement site, an eerie silence greeted them. There were no sounds of life, no dogs barking, no children playing. They reached the settlement and found it completely deserted. The houses and cottages had all been dismantled and taken down. The small fort had been enclosed by a sturdy defensive palisade made of tree trunks, suggesting the colonists had been preparing for an attack. But there were no signs of a battle. There were no bodies, no skeletons, no graves. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle. It was as if the entire community had simply packed up and vanished. John White remembered the plan they had made. He and his men began to search frantically for the carved message that would tell them where the colonists had gone. On one of the posts of the palisade, they found it. Carved into the wood in clear, block letters was a single word: Croton. White's heart leaped. Croton was the name of a nearby island, modern-day Hatteras Island, and it was also the name of the friendly Native American tribe that inhabited it. He knew the chief of the tribe, Manteo, who had traveled to England and was an ally. The colonists moving to live with the Croatan was a logical and hopeful possibility. And, most importantly, there was no Maltese cross carved above the name. This meant that they had not left in distress. White was eager to sail south to Croton Island immediately to find his family. But fate once again intervened. A massive hurricane, a storm of catastrophic force, descended upon the coast. The storm was so violent that it nearly sank their ships and made any attempt to sail south impossible. The captain of the ship, having already lost several anchors and facing the prospect of being wrecked on the treacherous coast, made the difficult decision that he could not risk his ship or his crew any longer. He refused to take White to Croton. He ordered the ship to turn around and sail back to England. John White was devastated. He had been so close, just 50 miles away from a potential reunion with his family, only to be turned back by a storm. He would never again be able to finance a return trip to the New World. He died a few years later in Ireland, never knowing the fate of his daughter, his granddaughter, and the 115 men, women, and children he had left behind. The colony of Roanoke and its people were lost to history. They had vanished from their settlement, leaving behind only a single, cryptic word carved into a post. The mystery of what happened to them, and what the word Croton truly meant, would become the first great unsolved mystery of the American continent, a question that has puzzled historians and archaeologists for more than 4 centuries. John White's tragic failure to reach Croton Island in 1590 marked the end of any official, organized attempt to find the lost colonists. For 17 long years, the mystery of Roanoke was left to the silence of the American wilderness. It wasn't until the establishment of the first successful English colony at Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607, that any serious effort was made to uncover what had happened to their predecessors. The Jamestown colonists, led by Captain John Smith, were aware of the lost colony and were instructed to search for survivors. Their search and the fragmented, often contradictory stories they gathered from the local Native American tribes would form the foundation of the primary and most widely accepted theory about the colony's fate. The prevailing theory for centuries has been that the colonists, facing starvation and the threat of hostile tribes, did exactly what their carved message suggested. They went to live with the friendly Croatan tribe on their home island. This was a logical and sensible survival strategy. The Croatan, led by their chief Manteo, had a history of positive relations with the English. Moving south to their island would have provided the colonists with a crucial source of food, shelter, and protection. This theory is supported by several pieces of historical evidence. John White himself believed this was the most likely outcome. He noted that the dismantling of the houses, rather than their being burned or destroyed, suggested an orderly and planned departure. The strong palisade they had built indicated they were preparing for a long-term stay, but also feared a potential attack, which could have been the final catalyst for their move. The Jamestown colonists heard numerous reports from the local Powhatan tribes that seemed to confirm this theory. They were told of a group of people living to the south who dressed like the English, lived in two-story stone houses, and used European tools. Captain John Smith even drew a map on which he marked a location where he believed the Roanoke survivors were living. However, the Jamestown colony was perpetually on the brink of its own survival, and they were never able to launch a full-scale expedition to the south to verify these claims. The most tragic part of this theory comes from a story told by the Powhatan chief to John Smith. The chief claimed that he had been responsible for wiping out the Roanoke survivors. He said that he had been warned by his priests that a nation would rise from the south to overthrow his kingdom, and believing the English settlers at Roanoke were the fulfillment of this prophecy, he had launched an attack. He presented Smith with several items: a musket barrel, a brass mortar, and some iron tools, as proof of his victory. If the story is true, it is a heartbreaking end for the colonists. After surviving for years by assimilating with a friendly tribe, they were ultimately wiped out by the political fears of another, more powerful one. This theory of assimilation and eventual massacre has long been the standard explanation. However, in recent years, new archaeological evidence and a re-examination of the historical records have led to the emergence of a compelling alternative theory, one that suggests the colonists did not go south to Croton, but went west, inland. This theory, known as the split colony theory, posits that the colonists did not all go to the same place. It suggests that a small group may have attempted to sail back to England on their own and were lost at sea. Another, larger group, perhaps as many as 95 people, including the women and children, moved inland up the Albemarle Sound to a location at the confluence of the Chowan and Roanoke rivers. This was a place that John White had marked on his original map as a potential site for a new settlement. The archaeological evidence to support this theory is tantalizing. In the 1990s and more recently in the 2010s, archaeological teams have been excavating a site known as Site X, near the location White had marked. There, they have found a remarkable collection of late 16th century English artifacts. These are not trade goods, but items that would have been used in daily life by English settlers. Pieces of high-end pottery known as Surrey Hampshire border ware, fragments of a German stoneware jug, a hook used for stretching canvas, and even a part of a flintlock pistol. These are exactly the kinds of items one would expect to find at a late 16th century English settlement. The most significant discovery came when archaeologists re-examined John White's original map of the area. Using modern imaging technology such as X-ray spectroscopy, they discovered that two patches on the map were concealing something underneath. Under one patch, they found the symbol for a fort, located at the very same Site X where the artifacts were being discovered. It appears that John White had marked a planned, or perhaps secret, inland settlement on his map and had later covered it up, possibly for security reasons. This suggests a new and compelling narrative. The colonists, knowing that John White's return could be delayed, decided to split up. A small group remained at the original Roanoke site to wait for him, while the main body of the colony moved 50 miles inland to the more sheltered and fertile location at Site X. The word Croton, carved into the post at the original site, was not a destination, but a message. It could have been telling John White that they were safe and had gone to live with the friendly Croatan tribe. A simple, prearranged code to let him know they were okay, even though their true destination was the secret inland fort. This theory is powerful because it explains the presence of the artifacts at Site X and the hidden symbol on White's map. But it also leads to the same tragic question. What happened to them? If they established a new settlement inland, why did they ultimately vanish? They may have faced the same fate as in the other theory. They could have been wiped out by a hostile tribe, like the Powhatan, or they could have succumbed to a devastating disease. It's also possible that they did not die out, but slowly and peacefully assimilated with a different local Native American tribe, their English identity gradually fading over generations until it was lost to history. These two theories, the Croton assimilation theory and the inland fort theory, are the most plausible explanations for the fate of the lost colony. However, the mystery has also attracted a host of more fringe and fantastical theories over the years. One theory suggests that the colonists were victims of a devastating hurricane that completely wiped out their settlement, leaving no survivors. While the Outer Banks of North Carolina are certainly prone to violent storms, it seems unlikely that a storm could obliterate every single trace of over 100 people and their dwellings. Another, more supernatural theory taps into the local folklore of the area. It suggests that the colonists fell victim to a curse or a malevolent spirit inhabiting the island. The most famous of these legends is that of the Wendigo, a cannibalistic spirit from Algonquin folklore. This theory, however, has no basis in historical evidence and is purely the stuff of ghost stories. And, of course, no great historical mystery would be complete without a theory involving aliens. Some have suggested that the colonists were abducted by an extraterrestrial craft, explaining their sudden and complete disappearance without a trace. While these fringe theories are entertaining, the reality of the colonists' fate was likely far more mundane and far more tragic. They were a small group of people, ill-equipped and unprepared, stranded in a vast and often hostile wilderness. They were facing starvation, disease, and the constant threat of conflict with the native population. The odds were stacked against them from the very beginning. The mystery of the lost colony of Roanoke is a powerful American origin story. It is a story about the promise and the peril of the New World. It is a reminder of the immense courage of the first settlers, but also of the profound fragility of their existence. The 115 men, women, and children of Roanoke were the pioneers of a new nation, but their story is not one of triumph. It is one of silence. Whether they were assimilated, massacred, or simply faded into the wilderness, their ultimate fate remains a ghost in the American historical narrative. The single word they left behind, Croton, is not an answer, but a permanent, haunting question mark, a 400-year-old riddle that continues to captivate and elude us. The search for definitive answers about the fate of the Roanoke colonists has become a multi-generational quest, a puzzle that has captivated not just historians, but archaeologists, genealogists, and scientists. In recent decades, the focus has shifted from interpreting the sparse historical documents to analyzing the hard, physical evidence being painstakingly unearthed from the soil of North Carolina. This modern scientific approach has added new, complex layers to the two leading theories: assimilation with the Croatan on Hatteras Island, or the establishment of a secret inland settlement at Site X. The Croton theory has been significantly bolstered by the work of the Croton Archaeological Society. For years, they have been conducting digs on Hatteras Island, the historical home of the Croatan tribe. Their findings have been remarkable. They have unearthed a significant number of late 16th century English artifacts, not just in one location, but scattered across several village sites. These are not just trade goods, but personal items: a piece of a writing slate, a hilt from a gentleman's sword, a small lead ingot used for casting shot, and even a gold signet ring belonging to one of the original colonists. Master Kendall. The sheer quantity and variety of these items strongly suggest that a number of the English colonists did, in fact, live among the Croatan people for a considerable period of time. This archaeological evidence supports a narrative of gradual assimilation. In this version of events, the colonists, facing starvation, abandoned their settlement and were taken in by Mantio's friendly tribe. They lived alongside the Croatan, intermarrying, having children, and slowly blending their two cultures. Over generations, their English identity would have faded, their language replaced by the local Algonquin dialect, their stories and histories merging with those of their hosts. They did not vanish in a mysterious cataclysm. They simply became part of a new, blended community. The descendants of the lost colony, in this view, are still walking the earth today, their English DNA mixed into the lineage of the local Native American tribes of North Carolina, a group now known as the Lumbee. The Lumbee tribe themselves have a long and powerful oral tradition that they are the direct descendants of the Roanoke colonists and the Croatan tribe. For centuries, they have passed down stories of their mixed heritage. They point to the surprising number of English surnames that have existed within their tribe for as long as anyone can remember, names like Dare, Cooper, and Stevens, which were the very names of some of the original lost colonists. This oral history, combined with the growing body of archaeological evidence, makes a powerful case for the assimilation theory. Simultaneously, the investigation at Site X, the inland location, continues to provide compelling evidence for the split colony theory. The discovery of domestic English artifacts in a concentrated area 50 miles from the coast strongly suggests that at least a portion of the colony moved inland to establish a new settlement. The fort symbol hidden on John White's map acts as a kind of treasure map, pointing directly to this location. These two theories are not necessarily mutually exclusive. It is entirely possible, and perhaps even likely, that the colony split up to improve their chances of survival. The main body, including the families, may have moved to the more defensible inland fort at Site X, while a smaller group of men may have gone to Croton Island to maintain a coastal presence and wait for John White's return. The word Croton could have been a message indicating the location of this smaller contingent. This dual location theory paints a complex picture of a colony struggling to survive by hedging its bets, but it ultimately leads to the same tragic questions. What happened to the group at the inland fort? Why did they also vanish? They may have faced the same fate as in the other scenarios: conflict with hostile tribes, devastating disease, or gradual assimilation with a different group of Native Americans. The mystery of Roanoke has become a powerful cultural symbol. It is America's first great ghost story, a tale of a group of people who stepped into a new world and were seemingly consumed by it. The story of Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas, is particularly poignant. Her fate is unknown, but she has become a symbol of the lost promise of the colony, a figure of myth and legend. The enduring power of the Roanoke mystery lies in its perfect ambiguity. It is a story with no final chapter, a historical vacuum that allows for endless speculation. The colonists left behind just enough clues to fuel our imagination, but not enough to provide a definitive answer. The single carved word, Croton, is a masterpiece of historical mystery. It is a clue that seems to offer a clear solution, yet it only deepens the puzzle. Today, the search continues. Archaeologists continue to dig at both Hatteras Island and Site X, each new artifact adding a small piece to the puzzle. Geneticists are working on the Lost Colony DNA project, attempting to trace genetic markers from the original colonists to their potential descendants in the Lumbee tribe and other local populations. It is possible that one day, a definitive archaeological find or a conclusive DNA link will finally solve the 400-year-old mystery. But perhaps the power of the Roanoke story is not in its solution, but in its persistence as a mystery. It is a story that reminds us of the profound challenges and the immense risks faced by the first European settlers. It speaks to the fragility of their existence and the vast, unknown continent that they were trying to tame. The 115 men, women, and children of the Roanoke colony were not just historical figures. They were real people who faced an impossible situation. Their story is not one of failure, but of a struggle for survival against overwhelming odds. Whether they were absorbed into the fabric of the New World or were tragically wiped out, Their fate remains a powerful and humbling reminder of the deep and often unknowable mysteries that lie at the very foundation of American history. They are, and will likely always remain, the Lost Colony. The Murders on the Colonial Parkway, the mystery of the lost colony of Roanoke, is a story about an entire community vanishing, leaving behind only a single, cryptic clue. But some mysteries are not about a disappearance. They are about a terrifying and deadly presence. This is a story about a series of crimes that unfolded not in a dark city, but on a scenic, historic roadway, a place meant for quiet drives and lovers' rendezvous. It's a story about a phantom killer who, for 3 years, haunted a beautiful stretch of road in Virginia, leaving behind a trail of dead couples and a baffling mystery that has remained unsolved for over 3 decades. This is the case of the Colonial Parkway murders. The Colonial Parkway in southeastern Virginia is more than just a road. It is a 23-mile scenic drive that connects the 3 historic points of America's historic triangle: Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown. It is a carefully preserved landscape, designed to give visitors a sense of what the area looked like in the 18th century. It winds through woods and along rivers, with numerous quiet, secluded pull-offs where people can stop to admire the view, read a historical marker, or simply enjoy a moment of peace. In the 1980s, these secluded spots were also popular local lovers' lanes, places where young couples would park their cars for a bit of privacy. It was this atmosphere of romance and isolation that a brutal killer would exploit. The reign of terror began in the autumn of 1986. The first victims were 27-year-old Kathleen Thomas, a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, and 21-year-old Rebecca Dowski, a student at the College of William and Mary. The 2 women were a couple known to be intelligent, well-liked, and private. On the evening of October 12, 1986, they were seen at a computer lab on campus. After that, they seemed to have driven to one of the quiet overlooks on the Colonial Parkway. It was the last time they were seen alive. A few days later, Kathleen's white Honda Civic was discovered, abandoned at the Cheatham Annex overlook on the parkway. The car was unlocked, and inside, police found Kathleen's purse on the floor. There was no immediate sign of a major struggle, but the car's location was suspicious. A search of the immediate area was conducted, but it wasn't until the next day that the horrific discovery was made. The bodies of both women were found inside the car. They had been pushed into the back seat and partially covered. The crime scene was brutal and deeply strange. Both women had had their throats cut with a knife so deeply that they were nearly decapitated. There was also evidence of strangulation by ligature. Their bodies were doused with diesel fuel, a clear but failed attempt by the killer to set the car on fire and destroy the evidence. Robbery did not appear to be a motive. Their purses and valuables were still in the car. The scene was a mixture of extreme personal violence and a strange, almost forensic awareness on the part of the killer. The use of the diesel fuel suggested a perpetrator who was trying to be methodical and cover their tracks. The investigation was launched by the FBI, as the murders had occurred on federal land. They were faced with a difficult case. The victims were well-respected young women with no known enemies. The crime seemed to be a random, opportunistic attack. The killer had left behind very little physical evidence. The FBI began to build a profile of their unknown subject, or unsub. They believed they were looking for a killer who was comfortable and familiar with the parkway, someone who knew its secluded spots and its patterns of use. The personal, up-close nature of the killing suggested a motive of rage or a need for domination. For nearly a year, the case went cold. The community was on edge, but as time passed, the fear began to subside, and many hoped it was an isolated, albeit horrific, event. But in September of 1987, the killer struck again, and the pattern became terrifyingly clear. The second set of victims were 20-year-old David Knobling and 14-year-old Robin Edwards. On the night of September 20th, 1987, David had taken his late father's pickup truck to pick up Robin from her home for a date. They went to a movie and then, like so many other young couples, they drove to a quiet, secluded spot to park. Their chosen location was the Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge, a marshy, isolated area at the south end of the James River Bridge, a place with a similar atmosphere to the Colonial Parkway overlooks. They were never seen alive again. David's truck was discovered the next day, parked at the refuge with the radio on and the windshield wipers still sweeping back and forth. Inside, police found the couple's clothes and David's wallet. But David and Robin were gone. A massive search was launched, but it wasn't until 3 days later that their bodies were discovered. A search party, which included David's own father, found them washed up on the shore of the James River, about a mile from where the truck had been parked. The autopsies revealed that both had been shot execution style, in the back of the head with a .38 caliber firearm. There was no evidence of sexual assault, and robbery was again ruled out as a motive. The police were now certain they were dealing with a serial killer. The pattern was emerging. A young couple, parked in a secluded lover's lane, targeted in a surprise attack. But the method of murder was different. The first couple had been killed with a knife, the second with a gun. This was a puzzling inconsistency. Was it the same killer using different weapons? Or were they dealing with two different killers or perhaps a team? The FBI and local police now had a full-blown serial killer investigation on their hands. They publicly announced that they believed the two double homicides were connected, and a wave of fear swept through the Tidewater region of Virginia. The quiet, romantic spots that had once been a refuge for young couples were now seen as hunting grounds for a phantom killer. The police issued public warnings, advising people to avoid these isolated areas at night. The killer remained silent for the next year and a half. The investigation continued, but with no new leads, the trail grew cold once again. The community began to breathe a tentative sigh of relief, hoping the killer had moved on, been arrested for another crime, or had simply stopped. But in the spring of 1989, the freeway phantom of the Colonial Parkway, as he was sometimes called, would return for his final and most baffling pair of victims. The pattern would be followed, but this time, the crime scene would be even stranger, leaving behind a set of clues that would only deepen the mystery and has continued to frustrate investigators to this day. After an agonizing 19-month silence, the phantom killer who haunted the scenic roads of southeastern Virginia returned. The fear that had begun to subside in the community came roaring back, confirming that the monster was still out there, still hunting. The third double homicide attributed to the Colonial Parkway murderer would follow the terrifying pattern of the previous crimes, but with new, perplexing details that would further complicate an already baffling investigation. The victims this time were two students from Christopher Newport College, 21-year-old Richard Keith Call and 19-year-old Cassandra Haley. Keith and Cassandra were on their first date. On the night of April 9, 1988, Keith picked Cassandra up from her dorm. They went to a party in the nearby town of Newport News. Friends who saw them there said they were happy and enjoying themselves. A new couple in the first blush of a potential romance. They left the party together sometime after midnight. It was the last time they were ever seen. The next morning, Keith's car, a red Toyota Celica, was discovered abandoned at the York River Overlook, another scenic and secluded spot on the Colonial Parkway. The scene was eerily similar to the previous two crimes. The driver's side door was open. Inside, police found Keith's wallet and Cassandra's purse. A pile of men's clothing was neatly folded on the front seat. There were no overt signs of a struggle inside the car, but this time there were no bodies. Keith Call and Cassandra Haley had vanished. The FBI and state police immediately launched a massive search of the area. They scoured the woods surrounding the overlook and used dive teams and sonar to search the deep, murky waters of the York River below. They found nothing. The disappearance was treated as part of the serial murder case, and the assumption was that the killer had, for some reason, disposed of the bodies more effectively this time, perhaps by weighing them down and sinking them in the river. The investigation into their disappearance yielded few clues. The FBI profilers believed the killer was likely a man who was familiar with law enforcement or military procedures, which would explain his ability to control his victims and leave behind such a clean crime scene. They theorized that he might be impersonating a police officer or a park ranger to approach the couple's cars. A person in a uniform, knocking on the window of a car in a secluded lover's lane, would be a highly effective way to gain control of the situation without a struggle. The victims would likely comply, assuming it was just a routine check, until it was too late. This theory would explain the lack of struggle at the initial crime scenes. The Parkway murders case fell silent once more. For a year and a half, the community was left to wonder if the killer had finally finished his spree. But in the fall of 1989, he would claim his fourth and final set of victims, leaving behind a crime scene that was, in many ways, the most perplexing of them all. On September 5, 1989, the bodies of 21-year-old Daniel Lauer and 18-year-old Anna Maria Phelps were discovered in the woods off a rest stop on Interstate 64, about 45 miles west of the Colonial Parkway. The discovery was made by a pair of hunters. Anna Maria's car had been found weeks earlier, abandoned at a rest stop on the other side of the interstate. Inside the car were her purse and other personal belongings. Daniel and Anna Maria were not a couple. Daniel was a student studying to be a carpenter, and Anna Maria was dating his younger brother. On the night they disappeared, Daniel had agreed to drive Anna Maria back to her home in Virginia Beach. They were last seen leaving his family's home around 10 p.m. They never made it to their destination. The condition of their bodies was horrific and deeply strange. They were found skeletonized, having been in the woods for several weeks. The autopsy revealed that Anna Maria had been stabbed multiple times with a knife. Daniel's cause of death could not be determined due to the advanced state of decomposition, but it was clear they were both victims of homicide. The most bizarre and unsettling detail was that a large portion of Anna Maria's body, including her hands and head, was missing, seemingly carried away by the killer. Daniel's wallet was found in his back pocket, once again ruling out robbery as a primary motive. The FBI officially linked the Lauer-Phelps murders to the Colonial Parkway series. The case shared many of the same hallmarks. A young couple targeted in or near their car at a secluded rest stop, and a crime that was not motivated by robbery. But there were also significant differences that complicated the profile of the killer. The location was far from the parkway itself. The victims were not romantically involved, and the post-mortem mutilation of Anna Maria's body was a new, disturbing element not seen in the previous crimes. The use of a knife in this final murder also circled back to the very first case, the stabbing of Thomas and Dowski, while the Nobbling Edwards case involved a gun. This inconsistency in the murder weapon remained a major puzzle for investigators. Was it a single killer who was versatile and chose his weapon based on the situation? Or were they dealing with a team of killers, or perhaps even a series of copycat crimes committed by different individuals who were inspired by the original murders? The investigation into the 4 double homicides, which now spanned 3 years and involved 8 victims, became one of the most complex and frustrating cold cases in Virginia history. The FBI had a handful of potential suspects over the years, but they were never able to gather enough evidence to make an arrest. One theory that gained some traction was that the killer was a former or active duty member of law enforcement or the military. The Tidewater area is home to a massive military presence, including Naval Station Norfolk and Langley Air Force Base. A person with military or police training would have the skills to control victims, handle weapons, and understand forensic countermeasures. The theory of the killer impersonating an officer remained the most plausible explanation for how he was able to approach and subdue the couples without a struggle. Another theory pointed to the possibility that the crimes were committed by someone who worked on the Colonial Parkway itself, perhaps a park ranger or a maintenance worker. This would give them intimate knowledge of the parkway's secluded spots and patrol schedules, and their presence would not arouse suspicion. The families of the 8 victims have lived in a state of agonizing uncertainty for over 3 decades. They have watched as leads have been exhausted and the case has grown cold. They have formed a tight-knit community of their own, united by their shared tragedy and their relentless pursuit of justice. They have worked tirelessly to keep the case in the public eye, hoping that a new witness or a new piece of evidence will finally emerge. The primary hope for solving the case now lies in modern forensic science. The FBI has stated that they have preserved evidence from the crime scenes, including potential DNA samples. In the era of genetic genealogy, where cold cases are being solved by matching crime scene DNA to relatives in public ancestry databases, there is a renewed hope that the Colonial Parkway murderer can finally be identified. A single hair, a drop of blood, or a skin cell left behind at one of the scenes could be the key to unlocking the entire mystery. The Colonial Parkway murders left a deep and lasting scar on the community of southeastern Virginia. The scenic, historic road, once a symbol of American history and natural beauty, became, for a time, a place of fear. The case is a chilling reminder of the vulnerability that can exist in even the most idyllic of settings. A phantom killer haunted that stretch of road, a predator who targeted young people in moments of joy and intimacy, and then vanished back into the fabric of a normal community. The identity of that killer, and the reasons for his savage, 3-year reign of terror, remain one of the most haunting and compelling unsolved mysteries in modern American crime. The 4 double homicides that terrorized southeastern Virginia between 1986 and 1989 left behind a legacy of fear and a collection of frustratingly disparate clues. For decades, the case of the Colonial Parkway murders remained stubbornly cold, a source of immense pain for the 8 families involved and a significant blemish on the FBI's record of unsolved cases. The killer or killers had achieved a terrifying level of success, leaving behind a trail of bodies but almost no usable forensic evidence from an era before DNA testing was standard practice. As the years turned into decades, the primary hope for a resolution shifted from traditional detective work to the promise of forensic science. The FBI has long maintained that they have biological evidence from at least one of the crime scenes that could contain the killer's DNA. This evidence has been the subject of intense focus and hope, particularly with the revolutionary advent of forensic genetic genealogy, the same technique used to identify other infamous cold case killers like the Golden State Killer. The process involves creating a DNA profile from the crime scene evidence and uploading it to public genealogy databases to search for partial matches to the killer's relatives, thereby building a family tree that can lead investigators to the suspect. For the families of the victims, this technology has represented the best, and perhaps last, hope for justice. They have been vocal advocates, pushing the FBI to utilize these new techniques to finally put a name and a face to the phantom who destroyed their lives. However, the process has been fraught with delays and what the families have described as a frustrating lack of communication from the federal authorities. The case took a significant public turn in 2021, when the families of the 8 victims, united in their quest for answers, held a press conference. They expressed their profound frustration with the pace of the investigation and called for the FBI to be more transparent about the status of the DNA evidence. They feared that crucial evidence was degrading in storage and that the window of opportunity to solve the case was closing. This public pressure brought the Colonial Parkway murders back into the national spotlight, renewing public interest and putting the FBI's handling of the cold case under scrutiny. In response to the public pressure and the advocacy of the families, there have been renewed efforts. The FBI has confirmed that they are actively working the case and are utilizing all available modern forensic techniques. However, they have remained tight-lipped about the specifics of the evidence they hold, a standard practice in an active investigation. While the forensic angle offers the most promise, the profiling and theoretical work on the case also continues. The inconsistencies in the killer's methods, the use of a knife in some cases, a gun in others, the varying levels of postmortem activity, remain a central puzzle. This has led to several competing theories about the nature of the perpetrator. One theory suggests a single, evolving killer. In this scenario, the murderer began with a knife, as seen in the Tomasdowski case, and then evolved to using a firearm to achieve more control over his victims, as seen in the Nobbling-Edwards case. His return to using a knife in the final Lauer-Phelps murder, along with the added element of mutilation, could represent a further psychological devolution, a descent into even more violent and chaotic behavior. Another persistent theory is that the crimes were committed by a team of 2 killers. This would help to explain the inconsistencies. Perhaps one partner preferred a knife, while the other preferred a gun. A team would also make it easier to subdue a couple in a car and control 2 victims simultaneously. This theory paints a picture of a partnership in evil, a dominant and a submissive partner, or perhaps 2 equally sadistic individuals working in tandem. A third, more disturbing possibility is that not all of the crimes are connected. While the FBI has officially linked the 4 double homicides, some investigators and researchers believe that they could be the work of 2 or more separate killers whose crimes happen to overlap in the same geographical area and time period. The Tidewater region, with its massive transient military population, and its network of secluded roads could have been a hunting ground for more than one predator. The Tomasdowski murders, with their specific targeting of a lesbian couple and the use of a knife, have some features that set them apart from the others. It's possible that this was a separate hate crime, and that another killer was responsible for the subsequent shootings. The Colonial Parkway murders have left an indelible mark on the psyche of the Tidewater community. The beautiful, scenic roadway, intended as a peaceful journey through American history, became, for a generation, a symbol of hidden danger and random violence. The lovers' lanes, that were once a rite of passage for young people, became places of fear. The case fundamentally altered the community's sense of safety, a loss of innocence from which it has never fully recovered. For the 8 families, the journey has been one of unimaginable pain and resilience. They have had to endure not only the loss of their children but also the endless, agonizing torture of not knowing who was responsible or why. They have become experts in their own children's cold cases, tireless advocates who have refused to let the memories of their loved ones fade. Their unity and their public pressure have been instrumental in keeping the investigation alive. The case stands as a chilling reminder of the dark side of seclusion, the very qualities that made the Colonial Parkway a place of beauty and romance. Its isolation, its quiet pull-offs, its dark, wooded stretches, also made it a perfect hunting ground for a predator. The killer was able to use the landscape as a weapon, a tool to isolate his victims and conceal his crimes. As of today, the case remains unsolved. The hope for a resolution rests on a tiny fragment of biological material, a genetic ghost left behind at a crime scene over 3 decades ago. The families and the public wait for the day that a DNA match will finally give a name to the phantom. Until then, the Colonial Parkway murders will endure as one of America's most haunting and complex unsolved serial killer cases. The 8 victims, Kathleen Thomas, Rebecca Dowski, David Knobling, Robin Edwards, Keith Call, Cassandra Haley, Daniel Lauer, and Anna Maria Phelps, are not forgotten. Their names are a solemn roll call in a story that is still waiting for its final chapter. A story of a beautiful road that, for 3 terrifying years, led to a dead end, the Ricky McCormick. Cipher the murders on the Colonial Parkway are a story about a killer who left behind a clear, brutal pattern, but no identity. But some cases are even more baffling. They are cases where the victim is known, the death is clear, but the motive is completely obscured by a final, cryptic message that seems to be written in a language no one can understand. This is a story about a man whose life was unremarkable, but whose death left behind one of the most compelling and confounding unsolved puzzles in the history of modern cryptography. This is the mystery of Ricky McCormick and his encrypted notes. Ricky McCormick was, by all accounts, a man who lived on the margins of society. In 1999, he was 41 years old and living in the St. Louis, Missouri, area. He was a man who had never quite found his footing in life. He was a high school dropout, unemployed, and had served time in prison for statutory rape. He lived a transient life, often staying with relatives or friends. He was known to have some health issues, including heart and lung problems, and he was described by his family as being street smart. But, in a detail that would become incredibly significant, they also claimed he could barely read or write his own name. He was a man who lived a simple, almost childlike existence, a man who seemed to be an unlikely candidate to be at the center of a complex national mystery. On June 30th, 1999, the body of Ricky McCormick was found in a cornfield in St. Charles County, Missouri, about 15 miles from where he was last seen. He had been missing for 3 days. The discovery of his body was puzzling from the very beginning. The field was remote and difficult to access, and it was not a place he was known to frequent. The official cause of death was also unclear. The autopsy found no signs of foul play, no gunshot wounds, no stab wounds, no evidence of a struggle. His death was officially ruled as undetermined, though the police and his family have always believed he was murdered. The location of his body, dumped in a remote field, was not consistent with a natural death. For 12 long years, the case of Ricky McCormick was just another sad, unsolved death, a cold case file gathering dust in a police station. He was just another man from the margins of society whose death went unnoticed by the wider world. But in 2011, the FBI did something highly unusual, something that transformed this forgotten case into an international cryptographic puzzle. The FBI's Cryptanalysis and Racketeering Records Unit, CRRU, the same unit that works on cracking codes from spies and terrorists, publicly released a plea for help. They announced that when Ricky McCormick's body was found in 1999, two small, handwritten notes were discovered in his pants pockets. For 12 years, the FBI's top cryptographers, some of the best codebreakers in the world, had been trying to decipher these notes, and they had completely failed. They were releasing the notes to the public, hoping that a brilliant amateur cryptographer or a member of the public might hold the key to cracking a code that had stumped the experts. The notes themselves are a baffling sight. They are a jumble of seemingly random letters, numbers, and parentheses, written in a rushed, frantic hand. There are no obvious patterns, no recognizable words. It is a true cipher, a block of text that appears to be complete gibberish. One note begins, MNDMKNERS, and continues with lines like ALPNTEGLSESEERTE. The other note is equally inscrutable, with lines like PRSEVSNNMRSEANDE. The immediate question was a profound one. How could Ricky McCormick, a man his family insisted was virtually illiterate, have created a cipher so complex that it had stumped the FBI's best codebreakers for over a decade? This central paradox is the heart of the mystery. The FBI's theory was that these notes were not just random scribbles. They believed the notes were written by McCormick himself just before his death and that they contained information about his murder, the names of his killers, the location of a drug deal, or some other crucial clue that would solve the case. They believed that despite his lack of formal education, McCormick may have used a complex, personal, and idiosyncratic system of code that he had developed over his lifetime to keep notes and reminders for himself. It was a language that only he could understand. The release of the notes to the public created a sensation in the world of amateur cryptography. Thousands of people from around the world downloaded the images of the notes and set to work, trying to find a pattern, a key that would unlock their meaning. The online forums and message boards dedicated to the case lit up with theories. One of the first and most common theories was that it was a simple substitution cipher, where each letter stands for another letter. But every attempt to apply a standard substitution cipher failed. The frequency of the letters in the notes did not match the frequency of letters in the English language. Another theory suggested it was a more complex form of code, perhaps a book cipher, where the letters and numbers correspond to words or pages in a specific book that McCormick owned. But with no knowledge of what that key book might be, this theory was impossible to test. Others suggested it was a form of shorthand, a personal system of abbreviations and symbols that would be unique to him. The fact that the notes were written in such a frantic, almost desperate-looking hand also fueled speculation. Was he writing them while under duress, perhaps in the back of a car, knowing that his life was in danger? Was this his final, desperate attempt to leave a message for the world, to ensure that his killers would one day be brought to justice? The case of Ricky McCormick's cipher is a mystery that operates on two levels. On one level, it is an unsolved homicide, the story of a man who met a violent end and whose killers have never been caught. But on another, more profound level, it is a cryptographic puzzle of the highest order. It is a direct challenge from a dead man, a message from beyond the grave that holds the promise of an answer, if only someone can find the right key. The illiterate man had, in his final moments, created a literary mystery that was as complex and as baffling as any created by a master spy. The two small pieces of paper found in his pocket are a testament to the fact that sometimes the most brilliant secrets are kept by the most unlikely of people. The FBI's public appeal for help in cracking Ricky McCormick's coded notes unleashed a global wave of amateur sleuthing. The story was irresistible. A virtually illiterate man creates an unbreakable code in his final moments, a code that holds the key to his own murder. Cryptography forums, Reddit threads, and cold case websites buzzed with activity as thousands of people applied their own unique skills and perspectives to the two baffling pages of scribbled letters and numbers. The theories that emerged were as varied as they were ingenious. Some people focused on McCormick's personal life, believing the code was not based on complex mathematics, but on a system deeply personal to him. They suggested the letters might correspond to the names of people he knew, the streets he frequented, or even lyrics from his favorite songs. For example, the line MNDMKNERS could be an abbreviation for something like mind me, call me, name, or else. This theory was compelling because it would explain why traditional code-breaking methods failed. The key was not a universal system, but a private, internal language. The problem, of course, was that without a deep, intimate knowledge of McCormick's daily life and personal slang, a knowledge that died with him, such a code would be impossible to reliably decipher. Other, more technically minded sleuths approached the notes as a true, structured cipher. They ran complex statistical analyses on the letter and number frequencies, searching for patterns that might have been missed by the FBI. One popular theory suggested it was a form of route cipher, where the message is written into a grid and then read off in a different, predetermined pattern, e.g., spiraling inwards or reading diagonally. Another theory proposed it was a grill cipher, where a sheet of paper with holes cut in it, the grill, is placed over the text, revealing the hidden message. Both theories were plausible but untestable without knowing the specific grid dimensions or the shape of the grill. The structure of the notes themselves was also a source of intense debate. The use of parentheses was particularly puzzling. In some lines, they seemed to group letters together, like ALPNTGLSESCERTE. In others, they stood alone. Some theorists believed the parentheses indicated a shift in the code, or perhaps pointed to a specific rule to be applied to the enclosed text. Others suggested they were simply flourishes, meaningless additions designed to make the code look more complex than it was. The frequent use of dashes and the mixing of uppercase and lowercase letters only added to the confusion. One of the most elaborate and well-regarded amateur analyses was done by a member of the American Cryptogram Association. He performed a deep statistical analysis and concluded that the notes were not a simple substitution cipher, but likely a more complex polyalphabetic cipher, where a single letter can be represented by multiple different symbols, making frequency analysis much more difficult. He also noted that the language had a rhythm and structure that seemed to mimic real language, suggesting it was not just random gibberish. He believed the code was solvable, but that it required a key, a word, a phrase, or a set of rules that was still missing. While the online world was buzzing with these cryptographic theories, the FBI continued its more grounded investigation into McCormick's murder. They re-interviewed his family and friends, trying to piece together a clearer picture of his final days. They learned that on the day he disappeared, he had gone to a local hospital for a checkup but had left before being seen. He was last seen alive on a bus, but no one knew his intended destination. The location where his body was found, a remote cornfield, was also a critical clue. It was not a place he could have easily reached on his own, as he did not own a car. This strongly supported the theory that he had been driven there by his killer or killers. The police believed the murder was likely drug-related. McCormick was known to occasionally associate with local drug dealers, and it's possible he was involved in a deal that went wrong, or that he had witnessed a crime and was silenced. This theory provides a potential context for the notes. If McCormick was involved in the drug trade, he might have used a code to keep track of deals, contacts, or drop-off locations. The notes could be a crib sheet for a meeting, containing information that he needed to remember. If this is the case, the notes were not written in his final moments, but were simply in his pocket when he was killed. This would explain why they were not found on a fresher piece of paper or written in a more panicked hand. However, this theory still has to contend with the central paradox. How did an illiterate man create such a code? His family has remained adamant that his literacy skills were extremely limited. They claim he could sign his name but struggled to write anything more complex. They believe he did not write the notes himself. This opens up another possibility, that the notes were written by someone else and given to McCormick. In this scenario, McCormick was acting as a courier or a mule in a criminal enterprise. He was given the coded message to pass on to another party. He would not have needed to be able to read it, only to deliver it. This would explain the complexity of the code. It was not his own creation, but the work of a more sophisticated criminal. His murder could have been the result of the deal going bad, or he could have been intercepted by a rival group who wanted the information he was carrying. This theory neatly solves the literacy paradox, but it raises a new question. If he was a courier, why was he the one who was killed, and what happened to the people he was supposed to meet? The FBI, for their part, have always held to the belief that McCormick was the author. They base this on their analysis of the handwriting, suggesting that the formation of the letters is consistent with someone who is not practiced at writing, someone who draws letters rather than writing them fluidly. They believe his family may have underestimated his abilities, or that he had a secret, self-taught intelligence that no one knew about. After years of public input and thousands of failed attempts at decryption, the FBI officially removed the McCormick cipher from their public top unsolved cases list in 2022. They stated that while they had received many interesting theories, no one had been able to provide a full, verifiable decryption of the notes. The case had gone as cold as a cryptographic puzzle can get. The mystery of Ricky McCormick's notes remains a perfect enigma. It is a case where the two central questions are inextricably linked. To solve his murder, you likely need to solve the code. To solve the code, you likely need to understand the circumstances of his murder. Each mystery is the key to the other, and without one, the other remains locked. The two small pieces of paper are a testament to a life that was lived in the shadows and a death that was shrouded in a secret language. Was Ricky McCormick a secret genius, a self-taught cryptographer who left behind the key to his own murder? Was he a willing but doomed participant in a criminal conspiracy, carrying a message he couldn't understand? Or were the notes something else entirely? The paranoid, meaningless ramblings of a troubled mind, a collection of gibberish that has been imbued with a meaning and a complexity that it never actually possessed? The truth is locked away in those cryptic lines, a final, silent message from a man on the margins, a puzzle that continues to challenge and taunt anyone who dares to try and read it. Despite the FBI's official removal of the case from its public plea list, the mystery of Ricky McCormick's notes has refused to die. It has become a legendary challenge within the amateur cryptography community, a cryptographic Everest that continues to attract new climbers hoping to be the one to finally reach the summit. The fascination lies in the profound contradiction at its heart. The creation of an apparently unbreakable code by a man who, by all accounts, should not have been capable of such a feat. In the years since the public release of the notes, the online community has continued to produce a steady stream of potential solutions, though none have been officially verified or have led to a breakthrough in the murder case. These proposed solutions often showcase incredible creativity and dedication. One of the most compelling lines of reasoning suggests that the code is not based on letters at all, but on sounds. This theory posits that McCormick, being semi-literate, thought in terms of phonetics rather than proper spelling. The jumble of letters could be a phonetic representation of words, a personal dialect written down. For example, M&D could be a phonetic spelling of money, and northeast could mean any. In this system, the code would be almost impossible for a computer or a traditional cryptographer to break, as it doesn't follow any standard linguistic or mathematical rules. It would be a code based on one man's unique and idiosyncratic way of hearing and interpreting language. Another popular theory is that the notes are a form of personal shorthand, heavily influenced by the slang and jargon of the St. Louis street and drug culture of the 1990s. The letter combinations could be abbreviations for people, places, or drug-related terms that would be instantly recognizable to someone within that subculture, but completely meaningless to an outsider. For example, ANDE could stand for, and then he or a specific location like North End. This would make the notes a practical document for McCormick, a way to keep track of his dealings in a world where you don't want to write things down in plain English. This theory is attractive because it grounds the mystery in the reality of McCormick's own life and environment. The case has also become a powerful example of the limitations of even the most sophisticated intelligence agencies. The fact that the FBI's CRRU, with its immense resources and brilliant minds, was unable to solve the puzzle highlights the unique challenge posed by a truly personal and non-standardized code. A computer can run trillions of calculations to break a mathematical cipher, but it cannot get inside the mind of a man like Ricky McCormick. It cannot know his personal history, his private slang, or the unique logic that might have governed his secret language. The McCormick cipher is a testament to the fact that the human mind can still create a lock that no machine can pick. The human element of the story remains the most tragic part. Behind the fascinating cryptographic puzzle is the unsolved death of a man. Ricky McCormick's family has had to live for over 2 decades without any answers or justice. For them, the notes are not an interesting puzzle. They are a source of profound pain and frustration. A final, taunting message that promises a resolution that remains just out of reach. They have watched as their loved one became a global internet phenomenon, his life and death reduced to a cipher mystery. A process that has been both a blessing, as it keeps the case alive, and a curse. The case also serves as a poignant social commentary. Ricky McCormick was a man who lived on the fringes, a person often overlooked by society. He was poor, uneducated, and had a criminal record. In life, he was largely invisible. It is a sad and profound irony that in death, through the creation of these mysterious notes, he has become the author of a puzzle that has captivated thousands and has been studied by some of the most intelligent people in the world. His mind, which was so often dismissed in life, created a legacy that has proven to be more enduring and more complex than anyone could have ever imagined. Today, the case of Ricky McCormick remains open, but cold. The most likely scenario, favored by police, is that he was murdered as a result of a drug-related dispute, and the notes are a cryptic record of that final, fatal transaction. But without a deciphered text, this remains speculation. The notes are the only real evidence, the only voice that remains from that day in June 1999. So what is the ultimate legacy of the McCormick cipher? It is a story that operates on multiple levels. It is a tragic, unsolved homicide. It is a world-class cryptographic mystery. And it is a deeply human story about a man who, in his final days, left behind a puzzle that may never be solved. The 2 small, crumpled pieces of paper found in his pocket are a monument to the unknowable. They are a challenge to our assumptions about intelligence, literacy, and the nature of secrets. The answer to who killed Ricky McCormick is almost certainly locked away in that seemingly random jumble of letters and numbers. But until someone, somewhere, has the flash of insight, the eureka moment that reveals the hidden pattern, the notes will remain silent. They are a final, whispered secret from a man who lived his life in the margins. A secret that has proven to be so well kept that it has achieved a kind of immortality, ensuring that the name of Ricky McCormick and the mystery of his death will not be forgotten.